He's still undefeated. Still the light heavyweight.
So the true boxing pound-for-pound #1, Terence "Bud" Crawford, gave his reaction to the European assassin Canelo Alvarez getting assassinated last night by Bivol, where Crawford said, "Canelo losing. It's over with. I don't see him knocking out Bivol." In addition to that, Crawford said, "Bivol did that. Congratulations. We know whose boxing pound-for-pound #1 is now." If you think about it, when is the last time the true pound-for-pound #1 lost every single minute of every single round and got completely whitewashed the way Canelo Alvarez did last night? I mean, Bivol beat up Canelo Alvarez the same way Shakur Stevenson beat up Canelo PED partner in crime, Oscar Valdez. We have to go back over 30 years when Roy Jones beat up James Toney. But the sad part, Bivol is no Roy Jones, and James Toney alone will knock Canelo Alvarez spark out in less than 5 rounds. If you don't think so, then like Roger Mayweather said, you don't know ish about boxing, as James Toney beat up on Holyfield at heavyweight, let alone to what he will do against Canelo Alvarez. It will be a murder scene. Listen, what we saw last night is a further proof to why Crawford is pound-for-pound #1. I mean, you got Crawford chasing the fighters that Canelo Alvarez is ducking, from Errol Spence to Charlo. So while Canelo Alvarez is hiding in Mexico, cooking some contaminated meat in order to get buff and move up in weight to get out of the NBF league, on the other hand, Crawford is trying to cook some Texas barbecue. So like Crawford said, who is #1 now? I mean, even Stevie Wonder can see who that is at this point. It's the smoke himself, Terence "Bud" Crawford, like us new media have been reporting for years. Despite what old media says and pushes their agenda with their powerful machines, at the end of the day, or at least the night, the truth will always prevail. That's why new media always comes out on top, because 3 things that can never ever be hidden are the sun, the moon, and the truth. Eventually, they will always come out, just like the truth came out last night about Canelo Alvarez, despite old media deception of Canelo Alvarez being boxing pound-for-pound #1. Well, Bivol just exposed that notion, putting an end to all of old media nonsense of deceiving the public for years by painting the narrative that the face of boxing, the best fighter when it comes to skill for skill, is a fighter on the hope list, while discrediting the fighter from the coincidental list, Terence "Bud" Crawford, simply because Crawford has the complexion for the neglection. Ever since Floyd Mayweather retired, old media have been desperately trying to stop another Floyd Mayweather from emerging, from becoming the face of boxing, because that time period was a living nightmare for old media and the decafs. If you notice, as soon as Floyd Mayweather retired, old media claimed that Roman Gonzalez was boxing pound-for-pound #1, over fighters like Terence Crawford and Andre Ward. Keep in mind, when Floyd Mayweather was still active, Andre Ward was always pound-for-pound #2, right behind Floyd Mayweather. But some way, somehow, as soon as Floyd Mayweather retired, Roman Gonzalez is now #1 pound-for-pound, who haven't fought anybody. But old media simply didn't care. Then, a year later, he gets knocked out by a fighter that no one knew. That's when old media shifted their attention toward Gennady Golovkin. They tried to hype him up as the one. Keep in mind, Triple G never fought a soul in his life. The only thing we knew him for was ducking Charlo, Andre Ward, and Lara. Despite old media calling him the boogeyman, he was more so the duck man in reality. But as soon as old media started calling Triple G the #1 pound-for-pound, he gets exposed by Daniel Jacob that same year, where he truly robbed Jacob. So old media shifted their attention and started calling Kovalev as boxing pound-for-pound #1, back when Kovalev was crushing everyone, literally catching bodies in the ring. Side note, this was not the washed-up version Canelo Alvarez fought. That's when old media told Andre Ward, leave Little G alone. He's no longer pound-for-pound #1. He already got exposed. Fight Kovalev, the killer in the ring. He's pound-for-pound #1 right now, and he's calling you out. And that's exactly what Andre Ward did. He moved up in weight and knocked out Kovalev, snatching his soul in the process, where Kovalev was never the same after that. Now, during the same time period, Terence Crawford became undisputed, the first one in 13 years, breaking the ice and becoming a transcender in the sport of boxing, where everyone wanted to become undisputed after that. That's when old media put Teddy Atlas on ESPN to tell both Andre Ward and Terence Crawford, you guys are not competing with each other. You guys are competing with Vasyl Lomachenko, who was 8-1 at the time. He just came off a freaking loss. And Teddy Atlas told both Crawford, who just became undisputed that same night, and Andre Ward, who just knocked out Kovalev, who old media said was pound for pound #1, that they are not competing with each other for the #1 pound for pound slot, but they competing with Vasyl Lomachenko, a fighter who was 8-1 at the time, who recently lost to Salido and turned down a rematch because he did not believe he could beat the Mexican style in Salido. Teddy Atlas had the audacity to disrespect both Crawford and Andre Ward and put Vasyl Lomachenko over them on the pound for pound list. That's when Andre Ward came up to the conclusion of retirement, because he figured, regardless of how much he proved himself, he will never get the credit he earned from old media biased reporters. Then years later, ESPN, the topic of conversation on the network was always, who's pound for pound #1? Pound for pound #1A is Crawford, pound for pound #1B is Vasyl Lomachenko, and vice versa. They were always comparing their performances, and Crawford was always outdoing Lomachenko every single time. That's when ESPN resorted to erasing Lomachenko losses to justify putting him pound for pound #1 over Terence Bud Crawford. Ironically, a year later, Vasyl Lomachenko got exposed, losing to Teofimo Lopez in an ugly fashion, where Vasyl Lomachenko, the way Shakur Stevenson put it, was a scared man fighting. He was afraid to let his hands go. So as soon as Crawford gets elevated to the pound for pound #1 slot, since Lomachenko lost, all of a sudden, few months later, Canelo Alvarez requests to fight Akhi Yildirim, a fighter coming off a loss and a 2-year layoff. As soon as Canelo beats the biggest cherry of the century, some way somehow he bypassed Terence Crawford on the pound for pound list, despite the fact that Canelo Alvarez is ducking everybody from the Charlo twins to Demetrius Andrade and Benavidez. That's when old media tried to justify that by claiming, oh, Canelo just became undisputed after he cherry-picked Akhi Yildirim. Keep in mind, Canelo Alvarez turned down undisputed against Demetrius Andrade to become undisputed in the weakest division in boxing. Even then, Terence Crawford became undisputed 4 years before Canelo Alvarez did anyway. But when Crawford became undisputed, no one cared. Old media didn't care, even though he was the first one to become undisputed in 13 years. Meanwhile, when Canelo Alvarez became undisputed in the weakest division in boxing, all of a sudden, it's such a huge accomplishment. I mean, the double standards are too real. Truth be told, when Crawford fought Postal, who just knocked out Matisse at the time, which no one did that to the machine back in his heyday, Postal was as good as Bivol back when Crawford fought him. Crawford also fought Gamboa in his prime, a gold medalist. Flex Diaz, another gold medalist. He fought Ricky Burns, Jeff Horn, Benavidez, Kell Brook, and Sean Porter. He knocked out every single one. Matter of fact, Crawford have knocked out every single opponent for the past 5 years, while being the boogeyman at the same time, winning all of the smoke with Errol Spence and even Jermell Charlo. 2 fighters that Canelo Alvarez even ducked, and that's a fact. So while Canelo Alvarez was too busy ducking, taking steroids, losing and robbing his opponents from Erislandy Lara, so on and so forth, Crawford was too busy kicking ass, knocking everyone out to this day. Last but not least, you see everyone claim that Canelo Alvarez can pick and choose whoever he wants to fight because he's the man. he's the shot caller, which, like I said before, you guys are 1000% correct. What is Canelo Alvarez doing with that position? Is he delivering the fights that everyone wants to see? From the Charlo, Benavidez, Andrade, so on and so forth? Or is he cherry picking? Which is my point exactly. That's why the Bivol loss was a cherry pick going wrong. On the other hand, when you see Crawford just now in that same position, he wants Errol Spence next, then Jermell Charlo. Two fighters that Canelo Alvarez actually ducked while being the bigger man, while supposedly the smaller man wants all of the smoke in Terence "Bud" Crawford. Now, even though he is the smaller fighter, he is the bigger dog. Nevertheless, the main point here is two fighters with the same position doing two completely different things. One fighter daring to be great in Crawford, the other fighter don't have the cojones to dare to be great. So he stayed too busy cherry picking until a cherry bit him back. With the facts being laid out, drop your thoughts in the comment section below, subscribe below, and click on the notification bell to be continued on the next episode of Akhi, TV. Peace, and I'm on to the next one.